Okay, I've got something interesting cooking here. Check this out. So I've decoupled the processing of the turn from the player input so that we have to process the input with another key after we put in our turn. So as an example, I will press down and the action count will go to 1. And the current action is at -1 because we haven't stepped the action list yet. So if we want to step the action list, we can press P for current action to increment to current action 1. Current action 1 would be the action that I just entered with the down arrow key. Now we press P again to actually process that action. Notice that the animation for the walk was separated from the actual movement. That is one bug that I have to fix. However, now if we place another enemy and I press down, now the current action is 2 from the previous turn still. And actually this is going to make it like that. So now if I were to press down, action count is 2. If I press P, current action is 1. If I press P again, the first action, my action, processes. If we press P again, the enemy action processes. Current action is at 3, which is greater than the action count. So when we press P again, it becomes -1. So our goal today is to not have to press P in order to process each individual increment of the whole turn after all entities have input their action for that turn. What we want to do is essentially after a player inputs their input for the turn, every other entity puts in their input, which is what we're currently doing. Previously, we were rendering all of the entity actions at the same time, and this kind of makes it look a little bit odd. And I desire a ability to step through each individual action one at a time, which we have just achieved. But now we have to tether this to a timing mechanism so that we can lock the game state from receiving any more player input during the processing of these turns, as well as be able to receive player inputs again once that lock is finished, but also to individually handle each entity and then move on to the next entity until we've run out of all actions for that turn, and then reset everything so that we can do it all over again. Here's the code that handles the stepping at the moment. We grab the current action and the current action count. We check to see if we even have any actions to begin with. Check to see if current action is -1, and we check to see if current action is greater than the action count. Otherwise, we process the turn action and then we increment the current action. Pretty straightforward. But this is just like the main inner part of this loop. What we want to do is have this trigger once and then once again and then once again until we get to the end of our actions. And we don't want everything to process so rapidly that we don't have any sort of a sense of like each entity taking its own turn. Step 1 is good refactoring. So what I mean by this is we want to pull it into its own function. So let's take this little chunk of code, right? Highlight it, yank it, and then right here, we don't want to call it process turn because we already have a function called that. So I'm going to call it alt just for right now. So there's our code. So now instead of having this big old chunk of code there, we can instead just have this one line where we call the function that we just defined. So there you go. That's kind of like step one in my mental process, is that, you want to have the code relatively easy to access, because ultimately what we're going to be doing is calling this function a certain number of times in a loop that isn't necessarily, and I've been trying to figure out how to describe this, because what we're really doing is we're creating an asynchronous loop within the context of a much larger sync loop, right? And we're doing this by kind of emulating mutexes with basic like Boolean flags and integer variables. Before we continue, let's make sure that what we wrote just works. So if I press down, P, 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 so that's basically like you want to do one extra press of the key P at the beginning in order to get the current action index centered on the first action. And then at the very end, after the last action processed, you want to press P again in order to reset it to -1. So that's one of the caveats of actually doing this. So let's add a couple enemies into the mix. All right, so we got 3 enemies. And if we press up, and then once I said P once to get it to the current action, press P again to actually process the first action, P again to process action 2, P again to process action 3, P again to process action 4, and then P again to reset back to -1. So you can imagine that we can find a way to step this automatically, right? Because the code for process turn originally occurs here, right? Like once we receive the player input, we process the turn for that player, and then we repeat the process for the NPCs. So we're decoupling this whole process in order to achieve a step-by-step iteration through each action that is in the action list, essentially. So in order to do this, you can see I've previously made a stab at this, but I'm going to redo it today before I continue on to blocking. Originally, I was working with a lock variable and a lock timer variable. Might be able to get away with just like one, but deciding where that's going to go and how we actually decrement and manage that value, and then what actually happens at certain points. Because one of the goals too is while we're actually processing the turn, we don't want the player to be able to input anything. We don't want to add any more actions to the action list. No more inputs until all actions are completed processing. So that's one of the goals as well. Actually, an important key point is that this is where we want to process the turn. And we want essentially a lockstep timer. So because all this code is running on a frame by frame basis, right? Like update game state. This is one of the reasons that we have to do this kind of in a synchronous fashion. Because the outermost loop draws the frame, updates the state, and does all this stuff. But as an example, like we are constantly calling update smooth moves if they exist, because an entity could be mid move and like the action is still processing, but the and actually this might end up going in a different location now that I think about it. But when the entity is moving, like the movement in the dungeon is done before the sprite position updates. So if the move's already occurred and we're doing a smooth move to represent this move transition, then we have to keep track of where in that current move the entity happens to be at. So if you remember that just a moment ago, I showed y'all process turn alt, right? I should have set a mark for that. Yeah, so let's mark right here. So that way just hop right back there. So process turn alt would essentially come down here, right? Like something like this. Like we would want to set some flag to start processing actions. Like I can imagine something like, oops, no, we don't want all of those. Imagine something like this. Um, so let's think through this. So imagine up here after handle NPC Lua, we set some flag like start processing actions equals true. So you could have something like that, and then outside of this, and perhaps we even switch this off until all of the turns have finished processing, all the actions have finished processing. We can imagine something like setting process actions equal to true, and then outside of the player input check, if G start processing actions and lock timer is 0, then we process one action and then we wait, right? You know, we wait 60 seconds and we check to see if there is a value on lock timer, and if it is, then we decrement it, and that way we only do it so many frames, right? So lock timer is a frame count. So if we do it for like 1 second, then we set the timer here so that this only processes if we're still processing actions. So we would need a check to see if action count, because the processing of the action, like process turn alt, actually handles clearing the action count as well once we actually finish going through the list. Then we can do something like start processing actions equals false, right? Because and then at that point we would be able to say input received equals false, and then the player would be able to do their turn again, and we can repeat all over again, right? I think this works. I think I've actually thought everything out. Now it's time to implement. Let's take a look at game state. It's been a little while since I've let's see. Take a look at game state here. So we do have an is locked. We do not have a lock on like a timer counter. So first we would set processing actions to true, right? And anyway, I actually called the variable something different, but same idea. Oh, I see. We already have lock timer up there. So if the lock's not 0, right? So the implication here is that we've already done one. Like we've already processed one action, so we're still on the timer loop to actually complete each turn until we get to the until we get to the next action. Now, if we are processing actions, like if if we get to the end of this, let's think about this for a second. We only want to set the lock if there are more. Well, no, that's not true. Actually, we'll just do it like this. So I gotta get an action count, right? So every frame, if the action count is 0, then processing actions should be set to false, and player input should also be reset to false. But this may or may not work. Contemplating. First of all, did it build? Okay, it built. So we would no longer have to press P if this were true. So if player input received, right? So we would want to set player input received to false here. So process turn alt would do one iteration through the action loop. Fuck it. Let's go ahead and try. Okay. This looks good so far, but it is a little bit slow. That's probably because of it's got to do the first one and the last one, right? So it's going though. So we could probably tune the time down a little bit. Maybe do it for like 15 frames. And if we can find a way to eliminate that first and last iteration, it will feel a lot more smooth and faster in general. But the idea is that we can tune this number and make it faster or slower anyway. But you can already see the lockstep actually working. This is exactly what I want. Now the problem here too is that the last enemy's animation for damage is occurring at the same time as the animation that the attack is supposed to be happening, and so the damage ends up overriding, and we're not like fully resolving the effects of the damage before the next animation occurs. So this is one thing that I'm going to have to figure out a way to smooth over. But in general, this is a good start. Now, in this case, because the hero's attack is the first action in the list, it actually kind of looks correct for the hero. But the enemy that's to his top left doesn't actually render the attack animation, which is definitely a bit of a bug. But you can almost see it there for like a frame. Like it comes out there for a moment. Um, so we're gonna have to find a way to kind of handle that. Like we want all the animations to resolve before the next action actually gets processed. Because what I have here is pretty good, I'm going to go ahead and commit. Let's do a build stats check-in. Twenty-five 43 lines of code. Build time's a little bit higher because I'm recording right now, but I did a pretty fast build just before. 0.54 seconds for GCC. And everything is still looking pretty good. So, like average GCC build time is 0.582, C length 0.647. And there you go. So I talked about a couple of the things I want to smooth over. We've got to get rid of those redundant beginning and ending action steps. We need to do a couple more switches in order to prevent the player from being able to input while those actions are processing. And also, we need to resolve all animation effects before moving on to the next action. Or we need to introduce enough time for those animations to resolve before that happens. Either way. If you like what I'm doing here, give me a like, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. Watch all my old videos. I'm making a good effort to video document my game development progress here. I have a dream game idea that I've been finally getting down and dirty to actually physically implement, and we're making progress. But it's very careful steps at a time. It's very consistent everyday work, and we're gonna get through it. We're gonna have a demo out hopefully by Christmas. I would like to say maybe even before that. It just depends on a couple things. I feel like we're like really, really like right there at the very edge. So to get these final details smoothed out, things should be pretty sweet. See ya.